Well, hello and welcome to Flynndogg Woodwork. So do you have a lucky number? Well, for me, it's the lucky number 7. However, for a lot of people, it's 13. For me, 13 is a little bit scary. I always stay on the 14th floor of any hotel, just to be a little extra safe. But today, I'm going to make an exception and we're going to look at 13 easy tips and tricks that can make you a better woodworker. So let's take a look at these tricks and see if they can help you out. So if you've been watching me for any period of time, you know that I've been trying to find the perfect corner clamp, and I found a few good ones along the way. However, after purchasing a lot of these corner clamps, I thought to myself there's got to be some easy designs I can make on my own that would suit my needs. And that's going to be our first 2 tips today. I'm going to walk you through making 2 types of corner clamps that you can easily make in your shop. So let's get started with the first one. So the first thing I'm going to do is rummage through my scrap pile and find an old piece of pallet wood. This will do just fine. Next up, I'm just going to cut a 6-inch piece of wood off of this pallet wood. Now that I have about a 6-inch piece of pallet wood cut out, I've marked where the center of this pallet wood is. Now let's go over to the drill press. In this drill press, I've got a 2-inch Forstner bit installed. So I'm going to drill all the way through the center of this board with that Forstner bit. Now that I have this piece of pallet wood cut out with a hole directly in the center of it, let's move over to the miter saw. So over here next to the miter saw, I do want to strike a line down the center of this hole. So I'll take my marker and I'll just make a rough line right where the center of this hole is. Now that I have this, I can then find the 45 degree and strike a line across each side. So now that we have our 2 45-degree angles marked on our workpiece, you'll notice that they're not exactly perfect and they may intersect with the circle in different spots. But that's okay, because over at the miter saw, we're going to use a stop block to make sure that both of these cuts are exactly the same. So now we're over at the miter saw and you can see I have a stop block in place. When we slide our workpiece in, you can see that we can match the angle of one of the sides, make a cut, then flip it over and make the other cut. This will ensure that both sides are intersecting with that circle in the exact same spot. So let's go ahead and make this cut. So first off, you want to save that small cutoff piece, as this is part of your clamp. We also have the original piece that we laid out with the lines on the back. So let's take it over to some plywood and I'll show you how this works. So here's a closer look at how this clamp works. You can see the larger portion of the clamp gives support to the outside of your box. The interior gives support to the inside. This ensures that you have a perfectly square corner each and every time. So not only could you use this clamp for things like boxes, but you could also use it for things like miters. Now that we've taken a look at our first clamp, let's take a look at our second corner clamp. Now for our second corner clamping accessory, we're simply going to need 2 pieces of scrap 3/4 inch plywood. And this is about 9 inches long by about 2.5 inches wide. So let's go make some marks on this plywood. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to strike a line at 1 inch on both of these pieces of plywood. So now that I have a 1-inch line struck on each piece of plywood running down the entire length of that plywood, I'm now going to strike a line at 2 inches from either side. So let's do that right now. Next up, I'm simply going to take a speed square and create a little bird's beak at each one of those intersections. So let's do that next. So if we take a closer look at what we've done so far, you can see 2 little bird's beaks on either side of the plywood. Now it's time to go over to the bandsaw and cut these notches out. Now accuracy of these cuts is not imperative because these are simply going to be notches where your clamps can grip onto. So let's cut these out and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So this is the shape you should have after cutting out those notches on the bandsaw. Now let's take it over to the assembly table and I'll show you how to use this with miters. So hopefully this angle can show you exactly how this works. You can see that I have the 2 pieces we just created attached to the miters with these quick clamps. You can also see that I have 2 F clamps attached to the sides that give inward pressure to that miter. So if you do a lot of picture frames or do a lot of miter joints in general, these could be the perfect clamping accessories to make sure that those miter joints come together seamlessly. Well, that covers our first 2 easy to make corner clamping and miter accessories. Now let's talk about gluing up some miters. So this is a tip that I use when I primarily glue up things like small boxes. And I've got 4 pieces of wood here that I put miters on each side. and this can be very difficult to glue up if you don't have the right clamps. So let me show you a quick and easy way to do it. So here I've got my 4 mitered edges for the sides of my small box. The first thing I want to do is to flip over each one of these sides. The next thing that I want to do is to push together the pointed sides of each side of the box and make sure they're completely flush. Once I have them all lined up, I'll then take some blue painter's tape and then tape them together. Once I have them all taped up, I'll flip them over so that I can see the inside of the miters. Then I'll take some wood glue and simply spread that glue inside the miters. Once I've applied that glue, I then can simply fold it up. And you'll see that the last side of the miter is not glued, so I'll add some glue to that. Now that I have glue on all the sides, I'll simply press the last 2 pieces together, and then I'll apply some tape to that as well. And if we flip this box on end, you can see that there's some nice glue out squeeze on each of the miters, and that's exactly what we're looking for. And just like that, blue tape, believe it or not, can provide just enough clamping pressure for things like miters on this small box. So now that we've talked about how to glue up a small mitered box with some blue tape, let's talk about what we can do if those miters don't look so good after the glue up. So here's a miter joint that I glued up a couple of hours ago, and I intentionally glued it up so it wouldn't look so good. You can see that there's a little bit of a gap here and it sits a little bit proud here. Now there's an easy way to fix this so that almost no one can tell that you made a mistake. Let me show you how to do it. So for this tip, all you're going to need is a screwdriver. Or if you're somebody like Tommy Lee, maybe you want to use a drumstick. Let me show you how to do it. So this really couldn't be easier. All you do is you take the shaft of your screwdriver and you rub it against that edge. You're going to flatten out the edge so that that little gap and that little proud area almost disappear. So what we're doing here is we're simply bending the wood grain across the seam of that miter. With just a little bit of sanding, that little seam will virtually disappear. So I'm going to sand this for a bit and I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. So I've just sanded this corner for about 15 to 20 seconds, and that seam that was in the miter has virtually disappeared. You would be hard pressed to see this unless you put this under a microscope. So I feel like we've been talking about corners and miters for quite some time now. Now let's move on to our next hack. I'll teach you everything you need to know about this hack. In fact, you might say I'll teach you all you need to know about it. So in woodworking, a lot of times you need to pinpoint where you need to drill out a hole. And I've got 3 awls here that I use on a regular basis. I've got this center hole punch, I've got this scribing tool, and I've got this awl that I got at Walmart. But little did I know, I had about 30 of these already in my shop. Let's talk about it. So we all have those old beat up screwdrivers, just like this one here. Now if I were to use this on a Phillips head screw, I guarantee it would strip that screw and I'd ruin my project. But we can convert this to an awl. Now I learned this old trick back in my prison days. We used to call these shanks. All we need to do is to take this screwdriver over to my belt sander and make it into a fine point. So let's go do that. Now it's much easier to make a shank in your workshop than it is in prison. All we're going to do is simply grind down the tip of this screwdriver until it comes to a fine point. Now as you probably saw from that, you need to be careful because there will be some sparks flying off this screwdriver. You also need to be careful because the shaft of this screwdriver will become very hot. But if you look at the tip of this screwdriver, it is now a perfect awl. It's very sharp and very pointed. So now that I've effectively taught you how to make a murder weapon, let's move on to our next tip. So earlier this winter, I created a video to show you how to protect things like wood glue over those long winter months. So if wood glue is getting old or it's not used for a bit, a lot of times you'll see a yellow tint on the very top of it. And this is usually a good indicator that it's time to get some new wood glue. However, after reading a recent article about wood glue, and yes, I read articles about wood glue, I came to realize that there's a way we can revive this glue. Let me show you what chemical we need to put in this wood glue to bring it back to life. So in this article, they were saying you just need to put a couple of drops of white vinegar into your wood glue and it should restore it. So that's what I'm going to do right now. Now I'm just going to apply a couple of drops to this container. And that should do it. Now, I'm not a chemist, so I'm not going to claim to know exactly why this works. However, I'm sure there's a chemical reaction between the vinegar and the glue that allows the glue to be usable again. Now, in full disclosure, I only tested this method for a couple of days. Now, in these couple of days, I did notice that the glue became much more fluid and appears to be much more usable. Now, most of the comments on this article really vouch for how effective this method was. So give it a try and let me know if it works for you. Well, that covers 6 quick tips for you so far. Before we move on to our 7th, I ask you to do me a huge favor, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and leave a comment. It really does help out this small woodworking channel, and I thank you in advance. Now let's move on to our 7th item. So our 7th tip is something that was inspired by a video that Stumpy Nubs recently did, and that's creating the perfect dado without using a dado stack. So for this next tip, you're going to need a piece of scrap wood that's the exact same width as the kerf on your saw blade. And you can see from this piece of plywood that I cut, this fits right into that kerf line. Now on this piece of scrap wood, you can see that I've highlighted an area where I want to create a dado. Now this is one of the most simple ways to create a perfect fit dado that I've ever seen. So let's go over to the table saw and I'll show you how to do it. So in order to make this dado, you're going to need a piece of scrap wood that's the same thickness as the dado you want to cut out. You're also going to need the piece of wood that you cut out that's the same thickness as the kerf of your blade. So let's get started in making this dado. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the piece of scrap that's the same thickness as the dado we want to cut out and place it right against my table saw fence. Then I'm going to take the piece that we're going to cut into with the dado laid out and I'm going to rest it against that scrap piece. Then I want to align the very edge of that dado right against the saw blade, and then we'll make our first cut. Once we've made that first cut, we can then move on to the second cut. In order to make the second cut, I'm going to remove the piece of scrap that's the same width as the dado you're creating and place my kerf width right against the table saw fence as well. Then we can place our workpiece right against that kerf and then make the second cut. Now that we have the first and the second cut made, we then can hog out the middle. So let's go do that right now. And now that we've hogged out the middle, you can see that that's a perfect fit. Now don't let those dark lines fool you, as that's actually just the markings we made to measure out the dado. Those aren't gaps in the dado. You can even see I can turn it upside down and it's got a friction fit. Well, that really couldn't be more simple to create a perfect fit dado without using a dado stack. Now let's move on to our next item. So our next 2 tips are going to be all about finding the center of a board without really paying any attention to how wide it is. Let's get started with our first tip. So have you ever had a piece of wood that you need to chop in half and it's at a weird measurement? Like this piece of plywood. It's at 8 5/16 of an inch thick. And that's a really hard math problem to do in your head on the fly. But there's a quick and easy tip to be able to find the exact center of that board without having to do a lot of math. Let me show you how. Now this really couldn't be any more simple. I've got the edge of my tape measure hooked on the end of one side, and then I've got the other side measured out to 9 inches exactly. Now if I divide 9 by 2, it gives me 4.5 inches. If I strike a line at 4.5 inches, this will give me the exact center of my board. With that tick mark lined up, I then can take a square and make sure I find the exact center all the way down. So instead of trying to do some crazy math by dividing some strange number by 2, simply find a nice even number like 10, 4, 9, divide that by 2, and then you can find the exact center of your board very easily and quickly. But if you're looking to scribe a line down the center of a board, there's an even simpler way to do this. Let me show you how to make a quick and easy jig to find the center of a board and strike a line down the entire length. So for this jig, I'm actually going to use my new awl, and I'm going to scribe a hole right at 2 inches and 8 inches. And then I'm going to scribe a hole right in between those two, which would be right at 5 inches. Now that I have those 3 dots made, I can then begin to make some cuts. Next up, I've got a 1/4 inch bit in my drill press, and I'm going to drill a hole right at the 2 inch mark and the 8 inch mark. So let's get started with that. So now that I've drilled out 2 1/4 inch holes on either side, I'm now going to drill out that center hole, which was at the 5 inch mark. And I'm going to use a 3/8 of an inch bit. So let's drill that out. So here we have our scrap wood. I've got 2 1/4 inch holes on either side, as well as a 3/8 inch hole right in the middle. Now let's move on to the next step. For the next step, I'm going to take 2 1/4-inch dowels and I'm going to place them right into those 1/4-inch holes. Now that we have the 2 dowels in place, the center hole will actually be for a pencil, and you can stick that right in the middle. Now let me show you how this works. So this really couldn't be any more easy. I've got a 2x4 as well as a piece of scrap plywood that I have no idea how wide it is. We're simply going to take the jig that we just made and we're going to place 1 dowel on either side of the board. Then we can place our pencil right in the center of this and strike a line down the center of the board. And you can see from both of these pieces of wood, I was easily able to scribe a center line on both pieces without doing any adjustments to my jig itself. So if you're looking to scribe a center line on any piece of wood, or you just want to find the center of a piece of wood, I hope those 2 tips will help. Now let's move on to our next one. So as you can probably tell from my shop, I'm a pack rat. I don't like to throw anything away, and I like to reuse anything that I can. And that's what this next tip is all about. So I've had this hacksaw for years. In fact, this hacksaw used to be my father's, and I have never changed the blade out in this. But we can actually use this blade for a special purpose. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So this is my old hacksaw blade, and it's still got some teeth in there, believe it or not. And it's amazing how much this new blade actually grips onto my finger when I push against it. But we can still use this old blade. Let's go over to the workbench and I'll show you how we're going to use it. So for this hack, all we need is our old hacksaw blade, 2 screws, and 4 washes. Let's install this thing and I'll show you exactly how it works. So the first thing we want to do is to make sure that the teeth of the blade are facing down. Then we're going to place it on our workbench and find the 2 holes that are on either side of the hacksaw. Then we're going to take our pencil and mark out those holes. Once we've done that, we can pre-drill each hole. So now that we've pre-drilled those holes, I'm now going to take a screw and place it through the holes that are pre-drilled on either side of that hacksaw. Then I'm going to place 2 washers on the other side of the screw. Once we've done that, we can drill this into our workbench. So it's probably right about now that you're asking, what am I going to use this for? Well, let's grab some sandpaper and I'll show you exactly how to use this. So I'm sure you've all wanted to cut down a piece of sandpaper before. Well, this makes it super easy. You simply slide it into that notch and you pull up and it slices it better than scissors can. You can make this any size you want using any size sandpaper and really get it down to a small piece. And just like that, you've given a second life to a recycled saw blade that you can use for years. Well, that's 10 tips so far and only 3 left to go. This next tip has everything to do with finishing. Now, I've purchased a lot of tools to help me when I'm finishing small projects. Let's take a look at some of these tools. Now, a lot of times when you're finishing small projects, you want to raise your project off the table surface so that it can dry easily. Now, you've probably seen things like these red triangles, but there's also things like these bench cookies that have little tops you can add to them that will raise your workpiece off your tabletop surface. Now, those finishing accessories are not too expensive, however, they're not free. This next tip allows you to do the same thing with stuff you have laying around your shop. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So this little hack really couldn't be easier. All you need is some pieces of scrap plywood and a couple of nails. I think you know what I'm going to do. Let me show you. So in order to make these, I'm simply going to take a common nail, find the center of that plywood, and hammer it through. And in just a few seconds, I was able to make 3 of these where I can rest my workpiece above my tabletop surface. And this serves the same purpose as this bench cookie or this red triangle. And you could really make these as large as you want. You could even put multiple nails in the same sheet of plywood. You could even make a bed of nails where you could place your workpiece right on top. So now that we've shown you how to make an easy finishing riser, let's move on to our next tip, which has everything to do with extending the life of your sandpaper. So you've probably seen these huge sanding erasers available online, and these things are great. They clean your sandpaper, no problem. But what if you don't have one of these? Well, all you need to do is to raid your kid's desk and find a little eraser. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So this is probably the dirtiest sandpaper in my shop, so I'm going to test it on this. And you can see a little eraser like this can do the trick if you're in a pinch. In fact, I've even heard you can use the bottom of a rubber shoe. I haven't tried it, but I've heard you can do it. Well, that covers sandpaper cleaning. This next tip is a hack using something you can also find in your kid's desk. Let's take a look at it. Now, unfortunately, after rummaging through my kid's desk, I was only able to find a binder clip about this size, but that's not the size we need for this hack. What we're really looking for is a large binder clip. And as you can see from this image here, you can use a large binder clip to create an excellent stop block for your miter saw. In the same fashion, however, I've really grown to like using clamps like this to create those stop blocks. Now before, I used to use a regular clamp, and these things are just so much more convenient to easily open and close them. And just like that binder clip, clamps like this allow you to easily adjust your stop block on the fly without having to loosen and tighten a large clamp. Well, we're down to our last tip, lucky tip 13. For this next tip, I had to make a trip to the kitchen. Let's take a look at it. So this next tip has everything to do with what I like to call glue slide out. Not squeeze out, but slide out. If you're ever trying to laminate two pieces of wood together, you place the two pieces of wood together and they can easily slide on your workpiece. But if you add just a little bit of salt between those two pieces of wood, you can prevent any of that slide out from occurring. You simply just sprinkle on a little bit of salt onto your workpiece, and it provides just enough abrasive surface to allow those two pieces of wood to stick together. So as you saw from that example, the salt will provide just a little bit of grit to prevent those two pieces of wood from sliding apart. So what happens to the salt? Well, the salt eventually dissolves into that glue, and it doesn't affect the holding power of that glue. So with just a little sprinkle of salt, you can be like Emeril Lagasse, BAM! And prevent all your laminated boards from sliding on you. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's 13 lucky tips and tricks. If you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and leave a comment. Until next time, take care as always.